An Apache woman was dragged to his ranch, but the rancher wasn't the monster she expected. Mihail had never felt fear like this before. The sun had just begun its slow climb over the rugged cliffs, casting long shadows across the dusty land. Her village, tucked between the canyon walls and the flowing river, should have been a place of safety, a place where her laughter could rise freely into the morning air. But that day, the world she knew had vanished. She had been tending to the small herd of goats near the edge of the village when the shouting began. The sound was sharp, urgent, and frightening, cutting through the quiet hum of morning birds. Mihail froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She could see figures moving through the dust, men on horseback, their faces masked by scarves. She didn't know them, yet she could feel their eyes on her, heavy and relentless. The goats scattered in every direction, their bleating filling the air, but Nahel could not move. Before she could even think of running, strong hands grabbed her. She struggled, kicking and twisting, but the men were stronger, faster, and determined. One of them hissed at her in a language she didn't understand, and fear surged like a river breaking its banks. She realized quickly that pleading would not help. The men had come for her, and nothing she could do would stop them. The ride was long and grueling. They brought her over rocky paths and through the dry desert plains. The sun was merciless, burning her shoulders through the thin cloth of her tunic, and her throat parched from thirst. She tried to memorize every turn and every landmark, hoping she might find a way back to her village. But the landscape was unfamiliar, vast and unforgiving. The wind whipped against her face, carrying with it the scent of dust, sand, and fear. She had never felt so small, so powerless in all her life. As the hours passed, the initial shock began to settle into a heavy, aching dread. Her mind raced with questions. Why her? Why this? Who were these men, and what would they do when they reached their destination? Every time she caught a glimpse of the man riding closest to her, she flinched. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with eyes that seemed to see everything. She assumed he must be the one in charge, the one whose reputation made the other villagers whisper in fear. Night fell, and the world transformed into a dark, silent sea of shadows. Naheli's fears deepened in the quiet, and every crack of a branch or rustle of the wind made her jump. The men built a small fire at a clearing near a dried-up riverbed, and she was forced to sit quietly beside it. Her hands trembled as she watched the flames dance, casting shadows across the rough faces of her captors. She wanted to close her eyes, to escape into sleep, but fear kept her awake. Her mind replayed everything she had heard about the rancher they were taking her to. A man said to be cruel, heartless, and unyielding. The thought made her stomach twist into knots. She remembered the stories told by her elders, whispered late at night by the fire. The rancher, they said, took what he wanted and gave nothing in return. People who crossed him disappeared or returned broken. Nahele shivered at the memory. Her own father's voice echoed in her mind, warning her always to respect the land and its dangers. But even his wisdom could not prepare her for this. She felt a strange, bitter mixture of anger and despair. How had her life, which had always seemed ordinary, turned so suddenly into a nightmare? In the early hours of the morning, the journey resumed. The men rode silently, the only sounds the thundering of hooves and the heavy breathing of the captives. Nahele's body ached from the ride. Every muscle in her back and legs protested, but she could not rest, not truly. Sleep felt like a betrayal to her own survival. She tried to steady her breathing, to quiet her thoughts, but the uncertainty gnawed at her relentlessly. By midday, they arrived at a rocky rise overlooking a wide valley. Below lay a sprawling ranch, surrounded by fences that marked the limits of someone's land. Smoke rose from a chimney, curling lazily into the pale blue sky. Horses grazed near the barn, and a few men moved carefully among the fields. Nahali's heart sank. This was the place she had been told to fear, the place where her life could change forever. The rancher awaited. She did not know what he looked like, but the stories alone were enough to make her knees weak. As they drew closer, she noticed the rancher for the first time. He was a tall man with broad shoulders, dressed in simple clothes that were worn but clean. His face was serious, and his eyes, dark and steady, observed the approach of the men and their captive. Nahali expected the cruelty of the stories to show in his expression, in the way he would command her or punish her. She braced herself for anger, for shouting, for the harshness of a man used to controlling everything. But when he spoke, his voice was calm, deliberate, and surprisingly gentle. He gave no orders to harm her, no words of mockery or threat. Instead, he asked questions quietly, his tone curious rather than cruel. Nahali could barely believe what she was hearing. Was this truly the man she had been warned about, the monster of the stories? Her mind spun in confusion. Fear had been her constant companion, and now uncertainty replaced it. The men tied her to a post near the barn to prevent escape, but even in this small act, she noticed the rancher's instructions were careful. He did not raise his voice, did not use unnecessary force, and when he looked at her, there was no hatred in his eyes, only observation. Nahel's fear did not vanish, not immediately. Trust did not come easily, but for the first time since the morning, there was a flicker of something new, a hint that maybe, just maybe, the world was not entirely filled with cruelty. Hours passed, and Nahel was given a small bowl of water and some bread. Her hands shook as she ate, the dryness in her throat making every sip and bite feel like a battle won. The rancher watched silently, his presence calm and non-threatening. Nahel's mind raced with conflicting emotions. Could the stories be wrong? Could a man like this exist in a world where fear often ruled? Her heart, still pounding, began to entertain a tiny spark of hope, fragile as it was. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and painted the sky with hues of gold and crimson, Nahel allowed herself a moment to breathe. The men who had brought her to the ranch settled in, but the rancher remained near, observing, ensuring nothing went wrong. He did not approach her aggressively. Instead, he moved with quiet authority, tending to the livestock and the land as though nothing unusual had happened. Nahel could not understand it, yet she could not deny that she felt a small measure of safety. That night, wrapped in a thin blanket provided by the rancher, Nahel stared at the stars, her mind a whirlwind of fear, disbelief, and cautious curiosity. She did not know what the next day would bring. Would the rancher's true nature reveal itself? Or was this calm only a temporary mask for cruelty? Sleep came reluctantly, her body exhausted but her mind unwilling to let go of vigilance. By dawn, she had made a silent promise to herself. She would survive this, no matter what. She would watch, listen, and learn. And if the rancher truly was the monster the stories claimed, she would find a way to endure, to survive, to return to her people. Fear was heavy, but determination burned quietly beneath it. For now she could only wait and observe, hoping that courage would be enough to carry her through whatever lay ahead. Nahel woke to the sound of horses quietly moving in the stable. The sun had barely risen, painting the edges of the sky with soft pink and gold. For a moment she felt the heavy weight of the previous day lift slightly. Her body ached from the ride and the long hours of tension, but the cool morning air and the gentle light gave her a strange sense of calm. She listened carefully, not sure what to expect, yet feeling a tiny flicker of curiosity she had not allowed herself before. The ranch was alive with activity. Men were already working in the fields. their boots crunching over dry soil, their voices low but clear as they gave instructions to each other. The smell of hay, dust, and morning coffee drifted toward the small cabin where Nahel had been kept. She had been given a simple place to stay, a small room that was clean and neat, though sparse. There was a thin blanket, a small cot, and a window that looked out onto the wide expanse of land. The room was nothing like she expected. There was no cruel trap, no evidence of punishment, just the quiet presence of a man who seemed to respect boundaries. Nahal's eyes lingered on the window as she watched a figure approach. It was the rancher Samuel Fletcher. He carried a bucket of water in one hand and a small cloth in the other. He moved with a slow, purposeful calm, his face unreadable, yet not unkind. Naheli's first instinct was to shrink back, to prepare for the worst, but something in the way he carried himself suggested that he did not intend harm. "Good morning," he said softly, his voice carrying easily across the small yard. "I brought water for you. You must be thirsty after the ride." Nahel stared at him. She wanted to respond, but words caught in her throat. This was not the voice of a man who would hurt her. Yet the caution that had been her companion for so many hours stayed with her. She nodded slightly, her hands trembling as she took the bowl from him. He smiled faintly, a small gesture, but enough to soften the tension in the air. "Eat something," he said. "You need your strength." She obeyed, carefully nibbling at the bread he had brought. It was simple and plain, yet nourishing. As she ate, she observed him quietly. He moved around the yard with purpose, checking on horses, inspecting fences, and calling to a few ranch hands. There was a rhythm to his work, a balance between authority and care. Nahel realized with a jolt that she had never seen a man like this in her life, a man who could command respect without fear, who could lead without cruelty. As the hours passed, Nahel began to notice small details. The way Samuel carefully lifted a foal that had gotten tangled in the fence, the way he spoke gently to the men, correcting mistakes without shouting, the way he paused to examine the land, the animals, and the tools, as if everything mattered equally. It was as if he treated life itself with a quiet reverence. Each act was small, yet together they formed a picture of a man who was not the monster she had imagined. Still, Nahele remained wary. She knew fear could be deceptive, and hope could be dangerous. She remembered the stories from her village, the warnings of her elders. People could be kind one day and cruel the next. She could not afford to trust him too soon. Yet curiosity began to grow, quietly and persistently, in the spaces where fear had ruled before. Later that day, Samuel called her to help with a small task in the barn. Her hands shook as she followed him, unsure of what he expected. She had never worked with livestock before, and the smells, sounds, and movement of the animals overwhelmed her senses. Yet, he did not push or scold. Instead, he showed her carefully how to handle the animals, how to calm them with patience rather than force. Nahela's fear slowly shifted into attention, her mind absorbing each instruction. "See," he said gently, "you have to respect them. If you try to force them, they will resist. But if you understand them, they will listen." Nahel nodded, repeating his words quietly in her mind. It was a lesson she had not expected to learn on a day when survival had been her only concern. There was a strange satisfaction in mastering something new, even under these circumstances. She began to notice how the animals responded to her touch, how they calmed when she moved slowly, and how the barn seemed less intimidating as she gained confidence. By the afternoon, Nahel found herself talking quietly to Samuel, her voice hesitant at first. She asked simple questions about the land, the animals, and the daily work. He answered with patience, explaining each detail in a way that made sense, never condescending. With each answer, she realized that knowledge could be a bridge between fear and understanding. The more she learned, the less terrifying this place became. He also asked questions, not invasive, but curious. He asked about her life before the village, her family, and the traditions she cherished. Nahale answered cautiously, testing the waters, unsure if sharing her life would be safe. Yet, he listened without judgment, simply nodding and acknowledging her words. It was a kindness she had never expected, a simple human respect that slowly eroded the walls of fear she had built around herself. As the day turned to evening, Nahale reflected on the events. She had expected a man who would punish her, who would remind her constantly of her captivity. Instead, she found herself learning, observing, and even laughing quietly at small mistakes she made while handling the animals. Samuel did not mock her. He guided her, correcting with patience rather than anger. It was disorienting, yet, in a way, it gave her hope. Night fell, and Nahale was allowed to return to her small room. She carried with her a quiet exhaustion, but also a strange sense of wonder. She had survived the first day, yes, but more importantly, she had begun to see the man she feared not as a monster, but as someone complex, someone capable of kindness. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Could this really be true? Could a man feared by so many be more than the story suggested? Sleep came more easily than the night before. For the first time since being taken, Nahale allowed herself to dream, not of escape, not of danger, but of the possibilities of understanding, of survival in a place she had once only seen as a prison. The soft wind whispered through the window, carrying the sense of hay and earth. It was a simple comfort, yet it grounded her, giving her a sense of stability she had not known for many long hours. The next morning brought more discovery. Samuel invited her to accompany him on a walk around the perimeter of the ranch. She followed cautiously, noticing the care he took with the fences, the irrigation channels, and the crops. Every action spoke of responsibility and respect for the land, and Nahale realized that his strength was not in cruelty or fear, but in understanding and diligence. She began to see that the ranch was more than a place of work. It was a world he had built with patience, skill, and quiet determination. As they walked, she asked questions about the animals, the seasons, and the harsh desert climate. Samuel answered each with thoughtful explanation, sometimes pausing to show her how to plant seeds, mend fences, or tend to a sick animal. Nahale listened, absorbed, and even practiced what he showed her. With each small task accomplished, she felt a quiet pride she had not expected to feel in a day that began with fear and uncertainty. By the afternoon, something had changed in her perception. The fear that had dominated her since capture was still present, but it was joined now by curiosity, respect, and a cautious hope. She saw Samuel not as the cruel rancher she had imagined, but as a man shaped by the harshness of the land and the responsibilities he carried. He had learned to survive, to thrive, and to command without cruelty, a realization that both surprised and reassured her. Dinner that evening was a simple meal shared quietly with Samuel. There were no harsh words, no reminders of her captivity, only the normal rhythm of human life. Nahale noticed how he spoke to the ranch hands, how he valued their work, and how he listened to their concerns. It was a lesson in humanity that no fear or rumor could have prepared her for. The world outside the ranch was harsh and unpredictable, but here, in this small corner of the desert, she could see kindness and understanding, even in a man others had labeled a monster. As the stars filled the sky that night, Nahale reflected on the events of the day. She realized that life was more complicated than fear alone. People were not always what stories claimed them to be. Samuel Fletcher, the man she had expected to be cruel, was teaching her that strength could be quiet, power could be kind, and fear could be replaced with understanding, if only one was willing to look closely. Her eyes closed with a sense of wonder and cautious relief. She did not yet know what the future would hold, nor did she trust that safety was guaranteed. But she had begun to see that even in captivity, the human heart could surprise her. The rancher was not the monster she had feared, and that realization gave her the first true moment of peace since her world had been turned upside down. The sun was high in the sky when Nahele woke that morning, casting its golden light across the vast expanse of the ranch. She had begun to feel a strange rhythm to life here, a pattern in which fear no longer dominated her every thought. The sounds of horses moving in the stables, the low murmur of ranch hands, and the soft rustling of the wind through the dry grass were no longer alarming. Instead, they became part of a world she was slowly learning to navigate. Samuel Fletcher appeared at the door of her small room carrying a bucket of water and a small cloth. "Good morning, Nahele," he said gently. "Are you ready to help me today?" Nahele nodded. Her hand still trembled slightly, but not from fear. This time, the nervousness was from anticipation, from curiosity, and from a desire to learn. She took the bucket from him and followed as he led her across the ranch. Today, he planned to show her the irrigation channels that ran through the fields, channels that brought water to the crops in this harsh and dry land. The walk was long, but it was not uncomfortable. Samuel moved with steady confidence, and Nahele matched her pace to his. Along the way, he explained the importance of water, how every drop was precious, and how careful planning kept the crops alive even during the driest months. Nahele listened closely, asking questions when she did not understand. Samuel answered patiently, never rushing, never assuming that she already knew. "Everything has a place here," he said at one point, gesturing toward the crops. "The land, the water, the animals, they all need attention, respect, and balance. If one part is neglected, everything suffers." Nahele thought about her own village and the stories her elders had told her about living with the land. She realized that even though this place was foreign, the principle was the same. Survival depended on understanding, patience, and respect. She began to see Samuel not only as her captor, but as a man deeply connected to the life around him, someone who understood responsibility in a way few others did. When they reached the irrigation channels, Samuel asked her to help with the small gates that controlled the flow of water. Her fingers were clumsy at first, but he guided her gently, showing her how to adjust the boards to allow just enough water to pass through. He did not scold when she made mistakes. Instead, he corrected her patiently. Each time she succeeded, however small the success, a quiet pride grew inside her. For the first time since being taken from her village, she felt capable. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower, Samuel suggested they take a break. They sat on the edge of the field, watching the water flow slowly into the crops, shimmering in the sunlight. Nahele felt a strange sense of peace. The tension that had dominated her since capture was easing, replaced by a careful curiosity about the man who had brought her here. "I never thought a man like you could exist," she said quietly, almost to herself. Samuel glanced at her, raising an eyebrow, a faint smile touching his lips. "A man like me?" he asked, gently. "Yes," she replied, hesitating. "The stories, they made me expect cruelty, harshness. But you are not like that." Samuel was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon before he replied. "Stories are often exaggerated, Nahele. Fear can make people see monsters where there are none. I do what I must to survive, to protect this land and those who work here. But cruelty? That is not strength. Strength is patience, understanding, and action when it is needed, not when it is convenient." Nahele absorbed his words carefully. They made sense. And yet, they were so different from what she had been taught to expect. She realized that this man, who had seemed so intimidating at first, had taught her a lesson about the difference between fear and respect. As the days passed, the routine of the ranch became a bridge between them. Nahale began to notice small things. How Samuel remembered which animals needed special care, how he spoke kindly to the ranch hands, and how he treated the land as if it were a living thing. She started to trust his guidance and even sought it, asking him for advice on handling tasks she had once thought impossible. One morning, while tending to the horses, a young colt became frightened and bolted. Nahale froze, unsure what to do. But Samuel was immediately there, calm and steady. He spoke softly to the colt, moving with care, and eventually the young horse relaxed. Then he turned to Nahale. "You see, calmness is contagious. If you panic, the animal panics. But if you stay steady, they learn to trust you." Nahale nodded, understanding more than he realized. The lesson applied not only to the animals but also to her own life in this strange place. Trust, patience, and observation were tools for survival, and fear was something she could begin to set aside. Their conversations grew deeper. Nahale began to ask about Samuel's life before the ranch, about the challenges he had faced as a boy and the choices that had shaped him into the man she now saw. He spoke cautiously but openly, revealing his experiences with loss, struggle, and the hard lessons learned from life on the frontier. Nahale listened, her respect for him growing with each story. In turn, Samuel asked about her life before the village, about her family, her people, and her traditions. Nahale shared small stories at first, testing the waters, and then, as trust grew, she spoke more openly. She told him about the songs her mother sang, the stories her elders passed down, and the values that guided her life. Samuel listened with attention, never interrupting or dismissing her words. It was a conversation of equals, despite the circumstances that had brought them together. One afternoon, as they walked through a field, Nahale spoke softly. "I never thought I could understand someone like you," she admitted. "I thought fear would always come first. But now, I see that people are more than what stories tell us. You are more than I expected." Samuel looked at her, his dark eyes steady and thoughtful. "And you, Nahale, are stronger than I could have imagined. Many would have broken under what you have endured. But you have watched, learned, and adapted. That is courage." Her heart swelled with a quiet pride. She realized that connection was more than words. It was action, patience, and the willingness to see the truth beyond fear. She had feared this man, yet through observation and shared effort, she had begun to understand him, and in turn, he had come to recognize her strength and resilience. Over time, small acts of trust grew into gestures of care. Samuel allowed her more freedom on the ranch, letting her move between the fields and the barn, teaching her to handle the work without constant supervision. Nahale began to move with confidence, her fear replaced by competence and awareness. She noticed the beauty in the land, the quiet rhythms of life that existed even in hardship, and she felt a deep connection to this world she had once only seen as a cage. One evening, as they repaired a fence together, Nahale looked at Samuel and realized something profound. She did not fear him anymore. Instead, she felt a sense of safety, respect, and even admiration. He had proven through actions that he was not the cruel man of legend, but a human being shaped by experience, capable of kindness and patience. Samuel, too, had changed. He had begun to see Nahale not as a captive, but as a partner in the work of the ranch, a person of intelligence, courage, and dignity. Her questions, her curiosity, and her resilience impressed him. He found himself considering her perspective and decisions, appreciating her insights, and respecting her strength. Their relationship had shifted from one of captor and captive to a cautious, growing understanding built on observation, respect, and shared experience. By the end of the third week, the bond between them was undeniable. They had shared stories, labor, and quiet moments of reflection. Fear had not vanished completely. There was always an awareness of the circumstances that had brought her here, but it had been tempered by understanding. Nahel had discovered that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to see clearly despite it. One night, sitting by the fire in the small cabin, Nahel spoke quietly. "I thought I would hate this place, hate the man who brought me here. But I see now, life is more complicated. People are more complicated. Fear does not always tell the truth." Samuel nodded, tossing another log onto the fire. "It rarely does. But understanding, patience, and careful observation, those show us what is real. You have learned that, Nahel, and that makes you strong." The fire crackled, and the night stretched peacefully around them. Nahel felt a sense of belonging she had not expected to feel in a place that began as a prison. She understood that connection was built not by circumstance but by effort, patience, and recognition of the humanity in others. The following days were filled with more work, more learning, and more quiet conversations. Each day strengthened the trust between them. Nahel began to anticipate the needs of the animals, the rhythms of the fields, and the patterns of life on the ranch. Samuel, in turn, relied on her insights, her careful observations, and her growing skill. Their relationship had transformed into one of mutual respect and shared understanding, a connection forged not through fear, but through recognition of each other's strength, patience, and humanity. The morning sun spilled its golden light across the ranch, illuminating the wide fields, the horses grazing quietly, and the quiet rhythm of life that had become familiar to Nahel. She had been on the ranch for many weeks now, and each day had been a lesson in patience, observation, and understanding. Fear, which had once ruled her every thought, had slowly transformed into respect and even cautious trust. Yet the question of her future weighed on her heart. She knew she could not remain here forever, that her life with her people waited for her, and that returning to her village was inevitable. As she moved through the barn, tending to the animals with care and attention, Samuel appeared, carrying a bucket of water. "Good morning, Nahel," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Are you ready for today's work?" Nahel nodded, taking the bucket from him. She noticed how routine their days had become. Each morning the work was demanding, yet purposeful. Each task required thought, care, and attention. It was different from the life she had known in the village, yet, in its own way, it was equally meaningful. She realized that the work itself had become a bridge, connecting her to this land, to the animals, and even to Samuel. By midday, Samuel suggested they take a break by the edge of the small river that ran near the ranch. Nahel followed him, walking slowly along the worn path. She felt a quiet comfort in the sound of flowing water, the soft rustle of the wind, and the gentle warmth of the sun on her skin. For the first time, she allowed herself to reflect fully on all that had happened since her capture. "I never thought I would understand you," she said quietly as they sat by the water, her voice thoughtful. "I expected cruelty, harshness, and fear. But you are nothing like I imagined. I see now that life is more complicated, and people are more complicated too." Samuel regarded her quietly for a moment. "Stories can be misleading," he said gently. "Fear can make people believe in monsters where there are none. But truth is found in observation, patience, and understanding. You have learned that, Nahel, and that makes you stronger than you know." She thought about his words carefully. They made sense. and yet they were different from anything she had been taught. Fear had been her guide for so long that trusting it felt safer than anything else. Yet Samuel had shown her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. The bond between them, built slowly through shared work, conversation, and quiet understanding, had taught her that trust and compassion were powerful forces, even in a harsh and unforgiving world. Over the next few days, Nahale began to prepare for her eventual departure. Samuel noticed her growing focus and asked her about it one evening as they repaired a fence together. "You're quiet today. Are you thinking about going back?" he asked gently. Nahale paused, hammer in hand. "Yes," she admitted softly. "I know I must return to my village. My people, my family, they are waiting for me. But I will leave with more than just memories of fear. I have learned so much here, about work, about patience, and about people. You have taught me something important." Samuel nodded, a quiet understanding in his eyes. "And you have taught me as well, Nahale," he replied. "I have learned to see the world from a different perspective, to respect strength that is quiet and courage that is patient. Your presence here has reminded me that people are capable of growth, understanding, and resilience." As the day of her departure approached, the ranch felt different to Nahale. She moved through the fields with ease, tending to the animals and checking the crops. She noticed the small details, the way the horses' ears twitched in the wind, the gentle sway of the corn in the sunlight, the soft chirping of birds in the distance. Each detail reminded her that life continued, and that beauty could exist even in difficult circumstances. The morning of her departure arrived, and Nahale packed the few belongings she had brought with her. Samuel met her at the edge of the ranch, the horses saddled and ready for the journey back. There was a quiet tension in the air, not of fear, but of respect and understanding. Both of them knew that this moment marked a turning point, not only for Nahale but for Samuel as well. "Thank you," Nahale said softly, her voice carrying the weight of her gratitude. "For your kindness, your patience, and your guidance. I will never forget what I have learned here." Samuel regarded her with steady eyes, his expression calm but filled with quiet emotion. "And I will never forget your courage, your strength, and your willingness to see beyond fear," he replied. "Go back to your people with pride. You have survived, learned, and grown. That is more than many could do." Nahale mounted her horse, feeling the familiar rhythm of its movements beneath her. She looked back at the ranch, at the land that had once seemed like a cage, and now felt like a place of understanding, growth, and even unexpected friendship. She saw Samuel standing by the fence, watching her, a quiet figure against the wide landscape. For a moment, she wondered if she would ever see him again. Yet, she knew that what mattered was not the distance between them, but the lessons and respect they had shared. The ride back to her village was long, and Nahale used the time to reflect on all she had experienced. She remembered the fear of the first day, the uncertainty of her captivity, and the lessons learned through shared work, quiet observation, and conversation. Each memory reinforced a deeper understanding that people were more than rumors, that courage could be quiet, and that trust was earned through consistent action, not words alone. When she finally approached the outskirts of her village, familiar sights and sounds greeted her. Children played near the river, women prepared food, and men worked in the fields. Her heart swelled with relief and recognition. She was home, yet she carried within her the lessons and experiences of the ranch. She had changed, and in some ways the village seemed different as well. Life, she realized, was a mixture of hardship, kindness, fear, and understanding, and she had now experienced the full spectrum. Her family welcomed her warmly, relieved to see her safe and unharmed, They listened with quiet astonishment as she recounted parts of her journey, though carefully omitting moments that might cause unnecessary fear. She spoke of the land, the animals, and the work, and her words carried the pride of someone who had faced fear and learned to grow through it. Nahel also spoke of Samuel Fletcher, the man who had defied the stories of cruelty. She described his patience, his respect for life, and the lessons he had taught her. Her family listened, some skeptical at first, but gradually they understood that there was truth in her words. Not all people were as cruel as rumors suggested, and courage could be found in unexpected places. Over time, Nahel shared her knowledge with others in the village. She taught younger women how to handle animals with care, how to work the fields patiently, and how to observe the land thoughtfully. Her experience on the ranch became a story of growth, learning, and respect rather than one of fear. She had returned not only as herself, but as someone who carried wisdom that could benefit her people. Samuel, meanwhile, continued his work on the ranch, but he often thought of the Apache woman who had come into his life. He remembered her courage, her intelligence, and the quiet strength she had shown in the face of fear. Her presence had reminded him of the humanity in all people, the resilience of those who adapt and learn, and the power of connection built on respect rather than control. Though miles separated them, the bond they had formed endured in memory and understanding. Nahel knew that she had been changed forever by her time on the ranch. She had learned that fear, while powerful, was not the only truth. She had learned that patience, respect, and courage could open doors that fear alone would keep closed. And she had learned that people, even those surrounded by rumors and assumptions, could surprise and teach in ways she had never imagined. As the seasons passed, Nahel's story became part of the village's lessons. Children learned not only the skills she had acquired, but also the wisdom of seeing beyond fear and assumption. They learned that understanding and connection could turn even the most difficult circumstances into opportunities for growth and learning. And while the memory of her capture remained, it was no longer a source of fear alone. It was a story of survival, courage, and the surprising kindness found in unexpected places. Years later, Nahel would remember the ranch, Samuel, and the lessons learned with gratitude. The memory of fear had transformed into a memory of growth, understanding, and human connection. He had been taken to a place she expected to be a prison, yet it had become a school, a teacher, and a space where she discovered the strength within herself and the truth of human goodness. She understood now that the world was complex, filled with challenges, but also filled with unexpected kindness. Fear, stories, and assumptions could not define a person. True understanding came from observation, patience, and the willingness to see beyond the surface. And in that understanding, Nahel found not only safety but freedom, the freedom of knowledge, respect, and connection. The story of the Apache woman and the rancher became one of quiet legend in her life, not for drama or fear, but for the lessons of courage, compassion, and the surprising strength of the human heart. It was a story of transformation, both personal and shared, and it remained with her as a guiding light through all the days that followed.